In North Korea, they buried a man alive for refusing to deny Jesus. But 3 days later, he walked out of that grave. And what he said when they found him will change the way you see faith forever. His name was Minho. He was 34 years old, a husband, a father of 2, and in one of the most dangerous countries on earth for Christians, he made a choice that would cost him everything. Or so they thought. This isn't just another story about persecution. This is about what happens when a human being faces the absolute worst moment of their life and still chooses to believe. And I need to tell you this because what happened in that shallow grave in the mountains of North Korea proves something that most of us forget when life gets hard. So here's what happened. Minho lived in a small village near the Chinese border. Life there was already difficult. Food was scarce. Everyone was watched. You couldn't trust your neighbors because anyone could be an informant, and the rules were simple. Worship the supreme leader, obey without question, and never, ever bring any other religion into the country. But Minho had a secret. Years earlier, he had met someone who smuggled a Bible across the border. Just a few pages. Not even a full book, just the Gospel of John. And those pages changed everything for him. He read them over and over until he had them memorized. He would whisper the words to himself at night when everyone else was asleep. He told his wife. At first, she was terrified. She begged him to burn the pages. She said it would get them all killed. But Minho couldn't let it go. He said the words in that book felt more true than anything he had ever been taught. And slowly, carefully, his wife started to believe too. They didn't tell anyone. They didn't start a church. They didn't even pray out loud. They just held on to this quiet faith in a country that would kill them for it. But someone found out. It was a neighbor. A man Minho had known his whole life. He had seen Minho acting differently. Noticed that he didn't bow as low during the mandatory ceremonies. Heard him mumbling something under his breath that didn't sound like the approved songs. So he reported him. One night, the police came. They didn't knock. They just broke down the door. Minho's wife screamed. His children cried. And they dragged him out into the street in front of everyone. They took him to a detention center, not a prison. Something worse. A place where people went and didn't come back. And for 3 days, they interrogated him. They wanted names. They wanted to know who gave him the Bible, who else believed, where the meetings were. But there were no meetings. There were no other believers. It was just him and his wife and those few pages of scripture. They didn't believe him. So they beat him. They starved him. They made him stand in stress positions until his legs gave out. And every time they asked the same question, "Do you deny Jesus?" And every time Minho said no. On the 4th day they made a decision. They weren't going to waste any more time on him. They were going to make an example out of him instead. They loaded him into the back of a truck. His hands were tied behind his back. His face was swollen from the beatings. And they drove him up into the mountains where no one would see, where no one would ask questions. When they stopped, they threw him out onto the ground. And then they handed him a shovel. "Dig," they said. Minho looked at them. He looked at the shovel. And he understood. They were going to make him dig his own grave. His hands were shaking. His body was weak. But he picked up the shovel, and he started to dig. It took hours. The ground was hard. The sun was setting. And with every shovel of dirt, he knew he was getting closer to the end. But while he dug, something strange happened. He started to pray, not for himself, not for rescue. He prayed for the men standing over him. He prayed that they would one day know the truth, that they would be forgiven, that they would find the same peace he had found. When the hole was deep enough, they told him to stop. They pushed him down into it, and Minho stood there in his own grave, looking up at the sky. One of the soldiers shouted at him one last time, "This is your last chance. Deny your faith and we'll let you go." Minho closed his eyes, and he whispered something. The soldiers couldn't hear it clearly, but later, one of them would remember the words, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." They started shoveling dirt on top of him. At first it was just his feet, then his legs. then his waist, and Minho kept praying, out loud now. Not for himself, for them, for his family, for his country. The dirt reached his chest, then his neck, and finally they covered his head. Everything went dark. Minho couldn't breathe. The weight of the earth pressed down on him. His lungs burned, his heart pounded, and in that moment he thought about his wife, his children, the life he would never get to live. But he didn't feel angry. He didn't feel afraid. He felt something else, something he couldn't explain. Like he wasn't alone in that grave, and then he passed out. The soldiers finished covering the grave. They packed the dirt down, and they left. They went back to the village and filed their report. Another enemy of the state eliminated, another threat removed, case closed. But that's not where the story ends, because that night something happened that no one could have predicted. A storm rolled in, not a normal storm, a violent one. The wind was so strong it tore branches off trees. And the rain came down like a flood. It soaked the ground. It turned the dirt into mud. And up in the mountains where Minho had been buried, the earth started to move. The grave collapsed. The soil that had been packed down tight began to slide away. And somehow, in the chaos of that storm, Minho's body shifted. His face broke through the surface, and he gasped. Air, cold, wet, beautiful air. He coughed, he choked. He clawed at the mud with his bound hands. And inch by inch he dragged himself out of that grave. When he finally pulled himself free, he collapsed on the ground. His whole body was covered in mud. His clothes were torn. His skin was cut and bruised, but he was breathing. He was alive. Minho lay there in the rain for a long time. He didn't know if he had the strength to move. He didn't know where he was or how far he was from the village, but he knew one thing. He wasn't supposed to be alive. And if God had pulled him out of that grave, there had to be a reason. So he started crawling. He couldn't walk. His legs were too weak. But he crawled. Through the mud. Through the forest. Dragging himself forward one hand at a time. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to keep moving. Because if the soldiers found him, they would finish the job. For hours he crawled. The rain kept falling. The forest was pitch black. And every few feet he had to stop and rest because his body was giving out. But he didn't stop. He kept going. And then just before dawn, he saw a light. At first he thought he was hallucinating. But as he got closer, he realized it was real. A small fire, hidden deep in the forest. And sitting around it were 3 people. They weren't soldiers. They weren't villagers. They were strangers. And when they saw Minho crawling toward them, covered in mud and blood, they jumped to their feet. One of them ran to him, a woman. She knelt down beside him and spoke in a language he barely understood. But then she switched to Korean, broken but clear enough. "Are you a believer?" she asked. Minho nodded. He couldn't speak, but he nodded. The woman turned to the others and said something quickly, and then they lifted him up. They carried him to the fire. They gave him water. They wrapped him in a blanket. And as Minho sat there, shivering and exhausted, he realized who these people were. They were missionaries, a secret network of Christians who snuck into North Korea to help believers escape. They had been waiting in the forest for someone who never showed up. And instead, they found Minho. One of them, an older man, looked at Minho's hands, still tied, covered in dirt. And he cut the ropes. "How did you get here?" he asked. And Minho told them. Everything. The arrest, the interrogation, the grave, the storm, the crawl through the forest. When he finished, no one said anything for a long time. They just stared at him. And then the woman started to cry. "God brought you back," she said. "He brought you back for a reason." Minho didn't know what that reason was yet, but he knew she was right. They kept him hidden for 3 days. They cleaned his wounds. They fed him. They let him rest. And when he was strong enough, they told him the plan. They were going to smuggle him across the border into China. From there, he could make his way to South Korea. He could start a new life. He could be free. But Minho didn't want to leave. Not yet. "My family," he said. "I have to see them." The missionaries shook their heads. It was too dangerous. If he went back to the village, he would be caught. And this time there would be no storm, no second chance. But Min-ho insisted. He said he needed to see his wife one more time, to tell her he was alive, to tell her what happened. So they made a plan, a dangerous one. They would sneak him back to the edge of the village at night. He would have 10 minutes, no more. And then he had to leave. That night, they brought him as close as they dared, and Min-ho slipped through the darkness toward his home. His heart was pounding. Every shadow looked like a soldier. Every sound made him freeze, but he kept moving. When he reached his house, he crouched outside the window. He could see his wife inside, sitting alone at the table. Her head was in her hands. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Min-ho tapped on the glass, soft, just once. His wife looked up, and when she saw his face, she almost screamed, but she covered her mouth. She ran to the door and pulled him inside. "How?" she whispered. "They said you were dead. They said—" "I was," Min-ho said, "but God brought me back." He told her everything, fast. There wasn't much time. And when he finished, his wife held his face in her hands. "Then you have to go," she said. "You have to leave and never come back." Min-ho shook his head. "Come with me. Bring the children. We can all—" "No," she said. "They're watching us. If we disappear, they'll hunt us down. But if you go alone, they'll think you died and we'll be safe." Min-ho wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. So he held her one last time. He kissed her forehead, and he whispered a promise. "I will tell the world what happened. I will make sure your sacrifice means something." And then he left. The missionaries were waiting. They took him across the border that night, through rivers and over mountains. And after days of traveling, Min-ho made it to South Korea. He was free, but he couldn't forget. He couldn't forget the grave, the storm, the hands that pulled him out, and he couldn't forget his wife and children, still trapped in that country. So he started talking. He told his story to anyone who would listen. Churches, news outlets, human rights organizations, and everywhere he went, people had the same reaction. They couldn't believe it. A man buried alive, a storm that collapsed the grave, a group of missionaries in the exact right place at the exact right time. It sounded impossible. But Min-ho had the scars to prove it, and the more he talked, the more people started to ask the same question. How did you survive? How did you keep believing when they were burying you alive? And Min-ho always gave the same answer. Because I wasn't alone in that grave. Now, I want to stop here for a second because I think we need to talk about what this really means. Most of us will never face what Min-ho faced. We won't be arrested for our faith. We won't be beaten. We won't be buried alive. But we all face moments where it feels like the dirt is being shoveled on top of us. Maybe it's a diagnosis. Maybe it's a betrayal. Maybe it's a loss so deep it feels like you'll never recover. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can give up. We can curse God. We can let the weight of the earth crush us. Or we can do what Min-ho did. We can pray, not just for ourselves, but for the people hurting us, for the situation we're in, for the purpose we can't see yet. Because here's the thing, Min-ho didn't know there was going to be a storm. He didn't know the grave would collapse. He didn't know missionaries were waiting in the forest. He just believed. Even when it made no sense, even when every logical part of his brain told him it was over. And that's the part of this story that I can't stop thinking about. Because faith isn't about knowing the outcome. It's about trusting that there's a purpose even when you're buried in the dark. And sometimes, God doesn't stop the dirt from falling. He lets you go all the way down. He lets you hit the bottom, because that's where the miracle happens. That's where you realize you were never alone. That's where you find out what you're really made of. Min-ho spent the first few months in South Korea trying to process what had happened to him. He lived in a small apartment provided by a refugee organization. He attended a local church. He tried to build some kind of normal life, but nothing felt normal, because every night when he closed his eyes, he was back in that grave. He could feel the weight of the dirt, the panic in his chest, the darkness closing in. And every morning when he woke up, he remembered the storm. The mud sliding away, the air filling his lungs, the impossible fact that he was still alive. People kept asking him to share his testimony. At first he didn't want to. It was too fresh, too painful, and part of him felt guilty. Guilty that he had escaped while his wife and children were still there. Guilty that he was safe while millions of others were still suffering. But then something happened that changed his perspective. He met another North Korean refugee, a woman named Sun Hee. She had escaped years earlier and had been living in South Korea ever since. And when she heard Min-ho's story, she started crying. "Do you know what this means?" she asked him. "Do you understand what God did for you?" Min-ho shook his head. He was still trying to figure that out himself. Sun-hee grabbed his hands. "You're not just a survivor. You're a witness. You came back from the dead. And now you have to tell people, not just about what happened to you, but about all the others who are still there, the ones who didn't get a storm, the ones who are still buried." And that's when it clicked for Min-ho. His survival wasn't just about him. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless. It was about proving that even in the darkest place on earth, God was still moving, still saving, still present. So he started speaking everywhere, churches in Seoul, universities, international conferences. And every time he told his story, something powerful happened. People didn't just feel sorry for him. They felt convicted. They realized that while they were complaining about small inconveniences, there were believers on the other side of the world literally dying for their faith. And they started asking the question that Min-ho wanted them to ask. What can we do? Because here's the reality. North Korea isn't just some distant problem. It's not just a political issue or a human rights statistic. It's a place where right now, at this very moment, people are being tortured for believing in Jesus. Where children are being sent to labor camps because their parents owned a Bible. Where entire families are erased because someone prayed out loud, and most of us have no idea. We go about our lives. We scroll through our phones. We worry about things that won't matter in a year, and we forget that there are people who would give anything to have the freedom we take for granted. Min-ho didn't want people to just feel bad. He wanted them to do something. So he started working with organizations that smuggle Bibles into North Korea, that help refugees escape, that support the underground church. And he kept telling his story over and over, because every time he told it, someone woke up. Someone realized that their faith had gotten comfortable, that they had stopped fighting for what they believed in. But there was one part of his story that Min-ho struggled to talk about, the part that happened in the grave, the part where he felt like he wasn't alone. Interviewers would ask him about it. What did you experience down there? Did you see anything? Hear anything? And Min-ho would get quiet. Because how do you explain something that doesn't make sense? How do you put into words a presence that you felt but couldn't see? Eventually, he found a way to describe it. He said it was like this. When I was in that grave, I couldn't see anything. I couldn't move, I could barely breathe, but I felt something, someone. It was like a hand on my chest, not a physical hand, but something that kept my heart beating, something that wouldn't let me give up. And I knew in that moment that even if I died right there, I wasn't dying alone. I wasn't dying without purpose. People would ask him if he was afraid, and Min-ho would always say the same thing. I was terrified, but fear and faith can exist at the same time. Fear is about what you can see. Faith is about what you can't. And in that grave, I couldn't see anything, so all I had was faith. Now, here's what's interesting. After Min-ho's story started spreading, something unexpected happened. Other North Korean refugees started coming forward with their own stories. Stories that had been buried for years because they were too painful to tell, too impossible to believe. One man told about how he had been thrown into a freezing river in the middle of winter for refusing to renounce his faith. He should have died from hypothermia within minutes, but he washed up on the bank hours later, still alive. And a farmer found him and hid him until he could escape. Another woman described being locked in a cell with no food for 2 weeks. She prayed every day, and on the last day when she was barely conscious, A guard slipped a piece of bread under her door. She never saw his face, never knew his name. But that bread kept her alive long enough to be released. These stories started coming out one after another, and people started to see a pattern. God wasn't absent from North Korea. He was there, in the prisons, in the labor camps, in the graves, moving in ways that defied explanation. And Min-ho realized something important. His story wasn't unique. It was just one chapter in a much bigger story. A story of a church that refuses to die no matter how hard the world tries to kill it. Because that's what the underground church in North Korea represents. It's not organized. It doesn't have buildings or programs or celebrity pastors. It's just people. Ordinary people who believe something so deeply that they're willing to die for it. And somehow, against all odds, it keeps growing. Estimates say there are anywhere from 50,000 to 300,000 Christians in North Korea right now. No one knows the exact number, but they're there, meeting in secret, praying in whispers, passing down stories of faith from generation to generation, and every single one of them knows the risk. They know that if they're caught, they'll be sent to a camp, tortured, maybe killed, but they keep believing anyway. Min-ho started asking himself a hard question. Would he do the same? If he had known what was going to happen, would he have still kept those pages of Scripture? Would he have still refused to deny Jesus? And the answer, he realized, was yes. Because those few pages of the Gospel of John had given him something worth dying for. They had given him hope, purpose, a reason to keep going when everything else in life felt hopeless. He thought about his wife and children still in North Korea. He didn't know if they were okay. He didn't know if they were being watched or punished because of what he had done. And that guilt was the hardest part, harder than the beatings, harder than the grave. But he also knew that if he had stayed silent, if he had denied his faith, he would have lost something more important than his life. He would have lost his soul. And his wife knew that too. That's why she told him to leave. That's why she stayed behind. Because she understood that some things are worth suffering for. Some truths are worth protecting, even when the cost is unbearable. This is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable. Because we live in a world that tells us to avoid suffering at all costs. To choose comfort. To take the easy path. But Min-ho's story challenges that. It forces us to ask what we would do in his situation. And most of us, if we're honest, don't like the answer. Because it's easy to say we believe in something when it doesn't cost us anything. It's easy to call ourselves Christians when the biggest sacrifice we make is waking up early for church or giving up something for a few weeks. But what happens when belief costs you everything? What happens when faith means losing your family, your freedom, your life? That's the question Min-ho lived out. And his answer was this. Faith isn't real until it's tested. And it's not tested until it costs you something. Now, I want to tell you what happened next. Because Min-ho's story doesn't end with him speaking at conferences and living safely in South Korea. About 2 years after he escaped, he got a message. It came through one of the missionary networks that had helped him, and it was from his wife. She was alive. The children were alive. And she had been in contact with the same underground network that had saved Min-ho. The message was short. Just a few sentences, but it said everything. We are okay, we are still believing, don't come back, keep telling the story. Min-ho broke down when he read it, because for 2 years he had carried the weight of not knowing. The fear that his family had been punished because of him. The guilt of being free while they were trapped. But now he knew they were okay. And more than that, they were still believing. Still holding on to the same faith that had almost gotten him killed. That message changed something in Min-ho. It gave him a new mission. He wasn't just telling his story anymore. He was telling their story. The story of every believer still trapped in North Korea. Every family torn apart. Every person suffering in silence. He started working more intentionally with organizations that supported the underground church. He helped smuggle Bibles. He raised money to support refugees. He trained people who were going into North Korea to help believers escape. And he prayed. every single day, for his wife, for his children, for the church in North Korea, for the guards who buried him, for the government that persecuted believers, because that's what he had learned in that grave. That prayer isn't just about asking God for things. It's about aligning your heart with His. It's about believing that even when you can't see the outcome, God is working. And God was working. Minho started hearing reports of more and more people escaping. More families being reunited, more believers finding freedom. It wasn't a flood. It was a trickle. But it was something. And every single story gave him hope that one day he might see his family again. But even if he didn't, he knew his life had purpose. Because he had been given a second chance, pulled out of a grave, sent back to be a witness, and he wasn't going to waste it. One of the most powerful moments in Minho's journey came a few years later, when he was invited to speak at a large church in the United States. Thousands of people packed into the building to hear his testimony. He told them everything: the arrest, the interrogation, the grave, the storm, the escape. And when he finished, the room was silent. Then someone asked him a question, a young man, probably in his 20s. How do we know God is real? How do we know this isn't just a coincidence or luck? Minho looked at him for a long moment, and then he said this: when you're buried alive, there's no such thing as luck. When you're in the dark and you can't breathe, and every logical part of you knows you're about to die, you don't think about coincidence. You feel it, that you're not alone, that someone is holding you. And when you wake up on the other side of that grave, covered in mud, gasping for air, you don't wonder if it was real. He paused. But here's the thing. You don't have to be buried alive to know God is real. You just have to be willing to trust Him when life buries you. When the weight of everything presses down and you don't see a way out. That's when you find out if your faith is real. Not when everything is easy. When everything is impossible. The room stayed silent. But Minho could see it on their faces. Conviction, realization. The uncomfortable truth that most of them had never really tested their faith because they had never really needed to. And that was exactly what he wanted them to feel. Because comfortable faith isn't faith. It's just tradition. It's just going through the motions. Real faith is what happens when you're in the grave and you still choose to believe. After that event, Minho kept traveling. He spoke in over 30 countries. He met with government leaders and human rights activists. He testified before international organizations about the persecution happening in North Korea. And everywhere he went, the same thing happened. People were moved. People were changed. People started caring about something bigger than themselves. But Minho never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the grave. And he never stopped praying for the day he would see his family again. That day came 7 years after he escaped. 7 long years of waiting, of hoping, of trusting that God was still working even when he couldn't see it. His wife and children made it out. Through the same underground network, through the same dangerous journey. And when Minho saw them again for the first time, he couldn't speak. He just held them and wept. They were different, older, changed by the years of suffering. But they were alive, and they were together. His wife told him later that she had kept his story alive, that she had told the children every day about the grave, about the storm, about the God who brings people back from the dead. And those stories had kept them believing, even when things got worse, even when they were questioned and watched and threatened. They held on, because they knew that if God could save their father, He could save them too. Today, Minho and his family live quietly in South Korea. He still speaks. He still works with organizations helping North Korean refugees. But now he's not alone. His wife speaks too. His children, now teenagers, share their own stories of growing up as Christians in North Korea. And together they represent something powerful. They represent hope. They represent the unbreakable reality that faith can survive anything. Even the darkest regime on earth, even a grave. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Minho's story isn't just about North Korea. It's not just about persecution or miracles or dramatic rescues. It's about what you do when life buries you, when everything falls apart, when the weight of the world presses down and you can't see a way out. Because all of us at some point will face our own grave. Maybe not a literal one, but a moment where we feel buried, suffocated, trapped. And in that moment we have a choice. We can give up. We can let the darkness win. Or we can do what Minho did. We can whisper a prayer. We can trust that we're not alone. We can believe that even if we can't see the storm coming, it's on its way. Because here's the truth that Minho discovered in that grave, and that his life proves every single day. God doesn't always stop the dirt from falling, but He never leaves you buried. He always makes a way out, even when it takes a storm, even when it takes years, even when it doesn't look anything like you expected. He makes a way. And sometimes the people the world tries to bury become the loudest voices, the strongest witnesses, the clearest proof that faith is real. Minho was supposed to die in that grave. The world tried to silence him, to erase him, to make him disappear. But God had other plans. And now Minho's voice reaches further than it ever could have if he had stayed safe. His story impacts more people than he ever could have reached in that small village. Because resurrection isn't just about coming back to life. It's about coming back with purpose, with a message, with proof that nothing can stop what God wants to accomplish. So if you're in a grave right now, if you feel buried by life, by circumstances, by pain you can't escape, I want you to remember Minho. Remember that the story doesn't end in the dark. Remember that storms come, that ground collapses, that hands reach down and pull you out when you least expect it. And remember that your burial might just be the beginning of your resurrection. The setup for a story that will give hope to people you'll never meet. A testimony that will echo long after you're gone. Because that's what happened to Minho. The man the world tried to bury became the voice the world needed to hear. And maybe, just maybe, the same thing is about to happen to you. If this story moved you, pass it on to someone who needs to hear it.